whatever makes okay, is it whatever is it whatever makes delusions dysfunctional has to do with them being irrational. And so I call this the rational dysfunction view. Importantly, I want to make this very clear before I continue that I'm not attributing this view to the DSM. So the diagnostic criteria for delusions has nothing to do with rationality or irrationality. However, the philosophical views that interpret what's going wrong in these cases discuss rationality. Okay. So the rational dysfunction account, this is kind of what I'm attributing to a blanket kind of variety of views on delusions. So there's a related debate that I just want to flag before I get into this about the doxastic status of delusions. So some people think that, and this is why I refer to delusions as irrational mental states throughout the talk rather than beliefs at all times, because some people don't accept that delusions are beliefs at all because they think that they're so irrational that they fail to achieve doxastic status. So this is kind of a controversial issue in the literature. But so all of these accounts, whether we accept that delusions are beliefs or we think that there's some other kind of mental state, the dominant view is that they're irrational, and characteristically so. So the rational dysfunction account is that delusions are irrational mental states, a result of dysfunction of rational capacities that guide behaviors that harm those who experience them. So importantly, we can think of rational capacities in a few different ways. I'm sure that those of you who are proponents of biological function views will want to talk about rational capacities in terms of biological adaptation or something like that. I think that there's a story we can tell there. I'm fine with that. But for my present purposes, I'll just remain agnostic on that issue for my talk. But so my response to this dominant view is essentially to say that, hey, delusions are no more irrational than ordinary irrational beliefs. In fact, my real view is a little bit stronger than that. I think that they're no more irrational than many semi-rational beliefs. But for this talk today, I am not going to take the stronger position. But so with this in mind, whatever makes delusions pathological is not a matter of lack of conformity to rational norms of belief. So irrationality is not sufficient for pathology, although it may be necessary. And that's kind of an important thing to keep in mind. So it may be necessary, but we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. So before I get into the heart of my view, I'm just going to give two classic cases of delusion that we can refer back to as we talk about the rational norms that we typically associate with delusions. So the first case is a case of Cotard syndrome. Dead people don't need insulin. So a young adult patient was admitted to the hospital presenting symptoms of severe malnourishment and oh gosh, I'm going to butcher this because I'm nervous. Bad symptoms associated with diabetes because the patient had not been using their insulin. Clinicians discovered the patient had not been using their insulin appropriately to manage their diabetes because they had a delusional belief that they were a ghost following a failed suicide attempt. So the patient believed that they were already dead. Thus, ghosts don't require insulin. So that's the first case. The second case is a also pretty classic case of erotomania. So a young adult male patient maintained that a woman he met in college was in love with him, claiming her social media posts contained clues meant to indicate her affection for him. The patient described the state of affairs to clinicians during and after law enforcement officials intervened, and he was expelled from school for his persistence and stalking. I'm going to come back to these cases, but I think that they do a lot to just emphasize why so many people find the rational dysfunction view very attractive. It seems like these cases of delusions are paradigmatically irrational. It seems pretty uncontroversial, right? They're being held incorrigibly. They're extremely recalcitrant in the face of contrary evidence. The patients are acting in a way that's detrimental to them. So these are all good reasons to think that there's something attractive about the rational dysfunction view. And so I certainly don't wish to discount that. However, I do think that there's a better explanation. So the question that I keep coming back to as I work on delusions is this question of whether there's reason to think that delusions are uniquely irrational when compared to other beliefs. And so we're going to go on to talk about a couple of other belief cases. But before that, I'm going to go through a few norms that we typically associate with rational beliefs and give a couple of reasons, provisional reasons, to think that maybe delusions don't deviate from those norms to the extent that we might typically think that they do. So, yeah, why I think that delusional mental states are uniquely irrational. So here are some points concerning interpretations of rational dysfunction in cases involving delusions. First is the falsity condition. I put an asterisk next to this because I think it might be somewhat misleading to talk about falsity in terms of rationality. However, I do think that it's important to say something about it, just because, I mean, as you can see from the DSM definition, delusions are considered false beliefs. So I think that there's something to say here about why we don't have to accept that all delusions must be false, why this isn't a constitutive feature. So for example, it's pretty easy to imagine cases in which delusional patients might have delusions that just incidentally turn out to be true. For example, someone might have a delusional belief that their neighbor is a serial killer and they're their neighbor's next victim. Seems outlandish, but just suppose that it could turn out to be true. We might wonder how often these kinds of cases would actually obtain. Probably infrequently, right? But in virtue of the fact that we can imagine it, we can probably accept that delusions need not always be false. So I'm just going to keep that in mind as I go forward. It's also important to note that ordinary beliefs are often false. We have many false beliefs. And so if this is somehow a measure of whatever is making delusions pathological, that would mean that a lot of our other beliefs would be pathological as well, which minimally seems unintuitive. So moving on to the second point, that delusions are based on incorrect inferences. This seems right to me, to be very straightforward. My primary response is that many non-delusional beliefs are also based on incorrect inferences. I don't want to say too much about this for the sake of time, but I think that that alone is also kind of reason to think that this incorrect inference point can't be the primary thing that's going awry, at least in terms of rational dysfunction, for delusions. And it's probably not good reason to think that delusions are pathological, because if that were true, then all of our beliefs based on incorrect inferences might be pathological in the same way. So we have to keep going. The third point, delusions are often bizarre. So you can read all about this from people like Campbell or Murphy. It is true that delusional beliefs are often incredibly bizarre. However, it's important to note that this doesn't always have to be the case. Many delusional beliefs have content that is seemingly quite normal, or at least benign, not so obviously bizarre. Plus, many non-delusional beliefs also have very peculiar content, and we're going to go on to talk about a few of those cases in a second here. But it seems like this bizarre condition, this mental content constraint, doesn't seem to be doing the work that we might intuitively think it would in terms of explaining what's making delusions pathological, at least in a rational dysfunction account. Because again, it seems like it could generalize to many other cases of belief that we typically don't think of as pathological. Moving forward again to the extremity condition. So yeah, and this is only true in cases of delusion involving value judgments, if we're staying consistent with the DSM definition. So my primary response is that it's not very clear how we could begin to measure what it means for a belief to be so extreme as to be pathological. And again, I'm kind of going to sound like I'm beating a dead horse, but I think it's going to turn out that a lot of us have value judgments that might be precariously on the spectrum of falling into extreme territory. So these are a couple of the main points that I have in mind, a couple of the provisional reasons I'd like to offer for us to accept that maybe these rational dysfunction norms aren't actually telling us what's going on in cases of pathological delusion. I want to also add just a couple of other points about why we might accept this idea that there are some aspects of delusions as mental states in general that seem relatively akin or aligned with the performance of ordinary beliefs. So typically, we think that ordinary beliefs are action guiding. That is to say that if S has a belief that P, S will act in a way that reflects their belief that P. It will be consistent. This seems especially true in cases of delusion. Delusional patients often act in ways that are remarkably consistent with the content of their delusions. This is part of why some people think that delusions are pathological. So this is something to keep in mind. The other thing I kind of wanted to point out is that delusional patients are often, well, they often exhibit extreme affective consistency or consistency in their affective states. So we typically think that people with good rational beliefs have emotions that are aligned with their good rational beliefs. And this is especially true in cases involving delusion. So with all that in mind, we can move forward. The primary takeaway, and I grant that the reasons I have offered to think that delusions um, are not, or that whatever is going awry in cases of delusion isn't irrationality. I grant that these reasons are decisive. However, I do think that there is a takeaway that we might be willing to provisionally accept, that there's no reason to think that delusions are pathological because they are irrational. So I'm not suggesting that delusions don't seem pragmatically rational, right? However, it's not clear that they perform any worse than many beliefs we typically do not consider pathological. Consider the following three cases. The first case, superstitious Sally. So Sally is a baseball player. She wears her lucky necklace for each game. She believes her lucky necklace improves her odds of winning the game and determines her performance. Sally loses her necklace before an important game and becomes distressed and preoccupied with the idea that she will perform poorly. So this is a pretty classic case of superstitious beliefs. Something seems to be going awry in these cases. I'm not quite sure what, but they do seem to resemble delusions in some sense. The second case in this section, Pizzagate Polly. Polly believes a cabal of politically elite pedophiles harm children in a secret room in the Comet Ping Pong Pizzeria in Washington, D.C. Polly is a QAnoner, like a shocking and concerning amount of Americans. But again, these conspiratorial beliefs do seem to resemble delusions in some ways, but we typically don't without extenuating circumstances or additional factors understand conspiracy theory related beliefs to be pathological, right? So moving into the third case, racist Richard. Richard is a white supremacist. He holds his beliefs firmly and against the evidence. So, such beliefs are generally fixed and unresponsive to evidence. They seem incorrigible, right? But we don't typically accept that they are so irrational as to be pathological. Delusions perform comparably to these other beliefs in terms of standard aspects of rationality. So irrationality can't account for whatever makes delusions pathological. So what can? This is how I sell my view on you guys. I offer a different account of what makes delusions pathological that doesn't rely on the rational dysfunction idea. So I am going to suggest that delusions are self-originating beliefs. What that means is that the propositional content of these beliefs is produced by internal processes. We'll have to talk a little bit more about this, I think, probably during Q&A, though I'll say a few more things now. But in this way, I think that this helps us explain how they differ from these conspiratorial beliefs, superstitious beliefs, or racist beliefs, because those beliefs are social, they're informed and inquired by other people. And I'm going to try to make the case that that's not true, at least in many cases of delusion. So that's the first component of my view, the self-origination view. And that has more to do with the origin and development of delusional mental states. It's worth noting that I do think that this self-origination view can apply to other kinds of beliefs, but that's outside of the scope of my current project. The second component has to do with the maintenance of self-originating beliefs. And so I think that the maintenance of these beliefs relies on and is supplemented by resistance from others, and in some cases, the impossibility of external corroboration for the content of the belief. So the lack of external corroboration serves an important justificatory role for the belief in question. So I'm going to come back to that in a second. But one virtue that I think my account might have is that it tells a story about why, again, the rational dysfunction view might seem, at least prima facie, quite attractive. So it might help explain why these beliefs often appear paradigmatically irrational. There's a sense in which self-originating beliefs are kind of opaque because of the internal processes that render their propositional content, which might make them appear problematically irrational in a way that might not actually be true. Additionally, this is worth noting because I anticipate that this will be a problem for a lot of people. I think that delusional beliefs obviously can be about the external world, and this isn't a problem from my view. I think that self-origination accommodates a way for individuals to be detached and disconnected from their evidence. So one way of kind of putting this into perspective is that suppose that someone has a delusional belief that they are Jesus Christ. Obviously, they didn't make up the idea of Jesus Christ, right? They learned about Jesus from other people. They have an idea that they got from the external world that's informed by their interactions with others and the testimony of others. However, the internal processes that contribute to their delusional belief are separate from that external input. So that's what I have in mind. It's also worth noting that many delusional beliefs, grandiose, erotomanic, somatic, thought insertion, thought broadcasting, and persecutory delusions are all internally oriented and about the delusional person most of the time, rather than the external world. So I did list a potential problem that I wanted to anticipate, though since this is a clinician-heavy crowd, I'm not so sure that this will be a potential problem for most people, but I'll flag it anyway because I think it's interesting. So one possible objection someone could have to my view is they could say, wait, if internal processes produce the propositional content of these self-originating beliefs, like you say, does this mean that all a priori beliefs are self-originating? And so for anyone here who is not familiar with that, that means that any beliefs that are knowable independently of experience in the sense that their truth is independent of experience. So beliefs like 2 + 2 = 4. So I want to say no, that's not the case. Delusions are self-originating beliefs with contingent empirical content. So I do want to just get that out of the way. I do not think that this will be an implication of my view, though perhaps someone will want to push back on that in Q&A. This is a problem primarily for epistemologists, though. just a couple more comments about the implications of my view before I conclude. So it might turn out that even if some delusions are more responsive to evidence than superstitious beliefs or racist beliefs, or seem to be performing better in terms of certain rational norms, the former are going to be pathological while the latter are not. But I actually think that this is an interesting implication, though it might be problematic in some sense. So I would actually be interested to hear some people's thoughts on this during Q&A as well. And then also, the DSM stipulates that delusions are generally not beliefs one's culture or subculture accepts. This is consistent with self-origination as a theory of whatever is making delusions pathological, which I think is a virtue of my account if we're willing to accept it. So this is consistent with self-origination. If the belief didn't come from one's culture or subculture, where did it come from? One's internal processes. Still, this stipulation does not shed light on the nature of the underlying pathology. It may have been made for political reasons, so to avoid pathologizing other cultures. The key issue is still going to come down to the origin and maintenance of delusional beliefs. There are a couple of residual questions I've been considering as my project evolves, and so I thought I'd list those for you guys as well in case they're of interest. So the first, could it be that it is always rationally permissible to acquire beliefs from other people, however strange, unusual, and lacking an evidential basis? I think that this could be a problematic implication of a lot of different views of whatever makes delusions dysfunctional. And then the second point is, can there be collective delusions in my framework, where delusions seem to be generally self-originating? Okay, so that's where I'll leave it off before Q&A.
All right. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Amanda. We're going to take a little bit. We're going to go till about 11:10 since we started about 10 minutes late. There are a lot of questions. I am going to do the American thing and take my chair's privilege. I'm so sorry, Celine. This is a U.S. thing, and yes, I'm the American guy to be totally insensitive to your cultural norms here. But I actually have a kind of a case study potential counterexample. I see case study potential counterexample, but I don't know if you think I've been studying targeted individuals. These are people who, many of whom will hear voices, sometimes have strange sensations on their skin. Very often they only hear the voices or have the sensations when they're standing in particular places in a room, or when they're not wearing, say, a protective body covering, and they'll suspect that they're being experimented on by high-tech, directed energy weapons. And then they'll go online trying to figure out what's going on. And there's a whole community of people who will say, this is exactly what's happening to you. You are being experimented on by high-tech weaponry. And they'll have a whole history of, potential technology, where it might be stored. They're all very familiar with the history of unethical human experimentation. And once they fall into these communities, you can't, there's no way to draw them back out. And I'm wondering if you would say this is not a delusion because of the externally reinforcing nature of it.
That seems right to me, as perhaps unpalatable as that might sound to a lot of people in here. I think that this kind of touches on like the literature on epistemic bubbles and echo chambers as well. And I think that this is a really interesting problem. And it also kind of ties into like this really sensitive issue of the extent to which we want to start pathologizing social beliefs at all. So to be completely transparent, I'm not entirely opposed to pathologizing social beliefs. I just think we would need to be really careful about how we get our normative basis for doing so. But yeah, I would say that it seems like they're not obviously delusional to me. But however, there is something else important about like the case that you raised, right? Which is that there's other symptoms of psychosis besides the delusion, right? So like these somatic symptoms, I think that complicates the picture, right? So yeah, I think I would have to like look into the cases more, but presence of the other symptoms of psychosis could complicate things.
Sure.
Thank you, Justin.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you for the talk. So first I have a clarificatory question because
Yeah.
of your self-origination view. I was wondering, so the self-origination must be a necessary condition, but I don't think it's sufficient, right? For
Okay. Yeah, that seems right to me.
okay, because in here it does seem like it is sufficient. It just says it's pathological if it originates from the self.
I think that it's one way that we might start to pick up on pathological beliefs. However, maybe I didn't make this clear in my talk, but I do think that we'd be hard pressed to say that irrationality doesn't have something to do with what's making these belief states pathological as well. So I was thinking more as a necessary condition, not sufficient, but maybe I need to just make that more clear.
Yeah. And also, I was wondering, I had a friend who was definitely psychotic during COVID, but her delusions did involve the classic COVID, like conspiracy theory contents, but she was definitely psychotic at that point. And I do think that her delusions, while they had the same content, were pathological in another sense than her fellow conspiracy people had. So, yeah.
Yeah, so that's really interesting. So like there might be a sense in which perhaps like there's a self-originating in which there's a self-originating element to like some of her like delusional beliefs. It's almost difficult to like try to characterize what's going on without knowing some more details.
Yeah.
But I think that there's something interesting there, yeah.
And then my last question is, so there's a strong connection between hallucinations and delusions. And some people could say that some delusions are rational because they follow, no, some delusions are rational because they follow hallucinations. So for example, if every time you drink water, it tastes weird, then in some sense it's understandable to think that you are being poisoned or something. But there's a strong connection between the hallucination that precedes the delusions in many cases. So what is your...
Yeah, surely. I think that again, maybe like that's kind of where we fall back on like this incorrect inference point, and we just have to like really figure out if like the phenomenological experience that someone's having of like this water tasting weird, if maybe that's just like a weird inferential move that they're making. But sorry, thank you. I think that's excellent, but it seems like we're hastily moving along. We can talk more after.
Thank you. It was really, really interesting. I'm just curious what you think about the following case. So Cheshire Calhoun has this paper about moral geniuses. So these people that seem to be way ahead of their times. So think about the first feminist,
Yeah.
the first liberated slave, like someone that even though everything in their community, in their world said, well, you should be treated this way, this person just felt, well, this is not the way I want to live, even though like everything around them was actually not a confirmation for this belief. And well, yeah, that kind of case. So I'm just wondering if that would be a delusion in the sense that, well, I mean, my worry is that that could be a delusion under this self-originating view. So yeah, I'm just curious. What do you think?
Thank you. This is a really great question, and it's one I've been thinking about. Yes, like these Einstein cases, people who are just ahead of their time, and perhaps like they're making scientific discoveries or something like that that no one else is corroborating at the time. It seems to me like there's something different about these cases, right? And I might have a couple of things to say. So the first is that it seems like in cases like that, there's a sense in which there might be something externally verifiable about the contents of their beliefs that just might not come from other people, right? I also had this kind of thought too that like, oh, it seems like a lot of philosophers are very committed to their views in a way that might be self-originating, but this is kind of why I want to take the self-origination view out of purely pathological context ultimately, because I think that there will be cases of self-originating beliefs that aren't always pathological. I just think that it might help explain why delusions might be pathological in certain cases. So that might not be the most satisfying response to your view. I'm thinking about it, and I think it's a great question. So thank you so much.
Hi.
Hi.
Thanks for the talk. It was great. So I guess I'm just interested in how possibly widespread self-origination might turn out to be. So we talked,
Say more.
yeah, we talked a little bit before about the possibility that memory, imagination, inference, and the like, by virtue of the fact that they are mediated by internal processes, are arguably self-originating, despite the fact that some of their content might come from perception. But I'm wondering if we understand propositional content to be concept involving. I don't know if you're committed to that.
Okay.
Uh,
Tentatively okay.
then unless you have a view on which perceptual content, or sorry, yeah, unless you have a view on which conceptual perceptual content is somehow in the world, like a McDowellian view, say, um, then self-origination is ubiquitous, because to get to perceptual judgment from non-conceptual content, you have to have some internal process that gives you that conceptual content. So what say you to that?
Yeah, that's a great question, Seth. Devastating question. I don't think that I'm going to have a great answer for you right now. I think that it's a problem from my view. I am more than happy to admit that. I'm inclined to think that there are a few different answers I could give. I could just deny that there's going to be like that conceptual element, right? And so maybe for the sake of preserving my view, that's what I'll do right now. But for what it's worth, I'm not so sure I'd want to commit to that long term. Thank you for your question.
Hi, thanks for your talk.
Thank
I'm
you.
just wanting to clarify what you mean by self-origination a little bit. I apologize, it may be just my own misunderstanding of what you're talking about. I'm wanting to do it by way of a patient that I met. So she was very delusional, and her delusions were all focused on this belief that her stepfather was a paedophile. And there was no evidence for this. But we dug into her history, and it turns out that she was abused by her real father, sexually abused by her real father growing up. And it seems to me that the important part of that delusion was her experience of being abused. And that's like this external experience that happened to her, not self-originating. It's possible that I just misunderstanding what you mean when you say that, but it seems to me that the important thing was external there.
Yeah, no, very good. So it seems like there's a sense, right, in which her experiences might inform this idea that more people, like because she experienced this like awful event, she might start again making these incorrect inferences that many other people have these dispositions, right? Pedophilic dispositions. It seems to me like I can still explain that kind of case by saying, yes, the content of her delusion surely is a concept she got from the external world, right? And it's a particularly personal concept, right? But still, I want to say that I think that I can maintain that the propositional content of her particular delusional belief in that case is self-originating. But I'm not so sure that I can say much more beyond that that might be satisfying. Maybe we can talk more later. Thank you for your question.
Hi.
Hi.
Thanks for the talk. Two comments, I guess. One is a tricky, I guess, more technical epistemological point that maybe self-originating beliefs are ubiquitous in a different way when we think about basic self-knowledge. So when I say, I know that I would like another cup of coffee,
Yes.
I worry that on some accounts, at least, this is something that's it's hard to say what the evidence for that might be. Some people think there is no evidence, in which case this starts to look like a delusion on your view. The other comment is that, well, maybe all of us are maybe a little bit more delusional than we like to think. And so here I'm thinking about like I think Eric Mandelbaum has been writing about like the psychological immune system.
Yes.
So beliefs like I'm a basically good person, seem like that could be self-originating, maybe not based on a lot of evidence, maybe irrational in a lot of ways. So I just wonder what you think about
Perhaps.
these. Yeah.
Yeah, no, very good. So the self-knowledge cases are actually kind of difficult to pin down, and I think a lot of like, so a lot of it's going to come down to like whatever view of self-knowledge that you're endorsing. So like the kind of example you gave actually includes like propositional content that includes like knowledge of a desire that one has, which I think also is going to complicate the picture of how we're taxonomizing that kind of belief that one might have, a belief about a desire. So I'm not too sure what I want to say about that at this point. However, for the second point, I think I'm okay with biting the bullet on this idea that maybe we're all just a little bit more delusional than we might think, or at least we all have these attitudes that seem to resemble delusional mental states. Because again, I don't want to say that all self-originating beliefs are delusions, but I do, like, ultimately, I really want to say that like there are many more kinds of self-originating beliefs. But I think that it might actually help explain why so many of these kind of fringe cases seem to resemble delusions. So thank you very much.
Thank you for your talk. I've not so much a question, but more of a worry for your hypothesis.
Oh, please.
Yeah. So what I think is that a lot of views that have actually been contested over the last, like in the past time. Already pointed to the idea that the delusion is something that originates within the person, and that over like the past years, a lot of views have contested this idea, and they have plausible reasons for that. And what I think is that your account actually is, in a sense, a setback to these views that the locus of interest for delusion is actually like the internal processes of the person that we claim to be delusional. So I think that it's in any case very important for you to point to that worry when you give a talk about this.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Can you be a little bit more clear about what exactly like the heart of the worry is?
I think the heart of the worry is that if we follow your point of view, that we have to look into what originates within the person, like what kind of internal processes are responsible for the delusion. Well, a lot of work has been done in researching what kind of societal influences are important for delusions, including that there is a group of people that I'm a bit nervous. I'm sorry.
Oh no, it's completely okay. Don't worry, take your time.
Yeah, so there are a lot of other delusional people that would maybe corroborate the delusional beliefs of people that are delusional. So they are not completely like separated from any societal corroboration.
Yeah.
And I think that your point of view kind of bypasses that. Okay, but next to the internal, like this worry of like going back to what is problematic with delusional people instead of zooming out, I think that another point that's related to this is that your account or your way of reasoning actually makes use of like zooming out from the people that are delusional, then going back to their internal processes. So first you say, well, okay, their beliefs, they are not irrational, and I have provisional reasons to think that. And these provisional reasons, they all point to other people having like shared characteristics with delusional people, like ordinary beliefs, many non-delusional beliefs. And you refer to like other cases with people that share characteristics of delusional people. And then you go to self-originating beliefs, but they seem suspect to this same kind of line of reasoning. I guess what I want to say is that you like go back and forth between this more zoomed out perspective on, oh, we live in a society, we all have these strange things that like match with delusions and match with delusional people. And then you go back to, oh, but what is actually delusional is something with the person themselves. which could be suspect to the same kind of line of reasoning you use to defeat the irrationality perspective. So it's like yeah, that's my concern.
Okay, no, I'm not sure I have a really great idea of like the heart of the concern, so I'd like love to talk more about this later because I think that you're onto something, and I think that there's a substantive concern here, but I just want to get more clear on what it is. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your talk. I'm gonna do the completely opposite.
Okay.
So this made me think of my bachelor's in neuroscience, where we talked about, I think it was medial prefrontal cortex. Could be completely wrong about it. It's also 10 years ago, so maybe all of this is useless information. But I remember that they specifically described like this part of the brain, the function we think it has in some kind of correlation way, is interoception. So it's the measurement of how you are doing. And I remember that the unique part about it is that it had no feedback from any perceptual parts of the brain or motor parts of the brain. So it was only internally looping. And that made me think of your internally created beliefs, like maybe proper function of that part is like self-evaluation, thinking, okay, how am I doing in this situation? Can I improve myself? But then when it, because you've been saying like a lot of self-created beliefs have a good function, like we do this for a reason. We think of things all the time, like these geniuses. So maybe there's some research there that can support like, oh, this is the biological function, and you can say, okay, that's what's going wrong. So
Thank
yeah.
you. If you could track that down by chance and send that to me, I would love to get an email from you. Thank you so much.
Thanks. I mean, I know very little about it. I mean, I really like the view.
Thank you.
What it seems to permit, and you know, that it may well be completely correct to permit this, is that somebody has a delusion, you know, say they believe they're Jesus Christ, and then they manage the success, or you know, a guru, and they managed to convince others, or indeed a worthy president of the United States, and then managed to convince lots of others of this. The delusion would cease to be a delusion. I mean, that strikes me as like not entirely problematic, because surely one of the things, you know, I mean, beliefs, truth tracking is like really hard. So it's not surprising that we get things wrong as individuals, but also that we get wrong as psychiatrists, as communities. And surely one of the things about the delusions is that it's in the interaction with others. You know, maybe what characterizes one aspect of delusion is that you might think you're Jesus Christ, and everybody points out to you, no, you're not, and you're like, and maybe they're right, as opposed to somebody who persists believing it. But so then if your community all goes, no, you really are. So that strikes me as like a fine part of the view. But then what it does is it kind of seems to move a lot of the problems we have about delusions and determining them just to the level of, yeah, can be really difficult to determine, and we might make a lot of mistakes in determining who has delusions.
Yeah, no, I think that that's right. And I think that this is possibly one way of pointing out really like, again, this precarious element of the diagnostic standard for delusions, right? Which has to do with like what we typically accept as like within social norms, or like what's socially beyond the pale versus what's acceptable. And so like maybe there is this kind of like unsavory implication of my view that, yeah, if you can convince 1,000 people that you're Jesus Christ, then you're not delusional. And that seems weird. And I definitely, I don't know exactly what I want to say about that at this point, but I think that you're right. Like there might be a problem here with my view being too permissive in that sense. So thank you. That's really interesting. Maybe not. We'll see. I'll think about it.
Okay,
Thank you.
thanks for the talk. I have two small questions. First one is, how does your self-originating view deal with superstitious Sally? I didn't really get that because
Yeah.
I didn't see why there is no self-origination here. And second, I'm no expert on delusions, but as far as I'm aware, one influential theory is that delusions are always responses to abnormal experiences. And if that's the case, then this looks a lot like, yeah, it would imply your self-origination view. And so I wonder whether you can say more about this.
Yeah, thank you so much. Gosh, I'm so sorry. Your first question like immediately slipped my mind. Can you? Oh yeah, superstitious Sally. Oh no, good. Yeah, so I actually kind of had the thought when I was reviewing my handout where I was like, oh, I'm not so sure that this is the kind of case that I had in mind. But yeah, maybe I'll just stipulate that she came up with the idea of the necklace being lucky on her own. And then maybe that's enough to just push that to the side for a second, and then maybe I'd replace that case in the paper. But so I share your concern. Yeah. So I mean, oh yeah. No, yeah, that seems right. Also, though, I think that we'll find that superstitious beliefs are generally like they at the very least don't seem to receive like the same kind of opposition externally that a lot of our other beliefs do. Like, I think that most people probably have superstitious beliefs and like they'll have this second order belief that they probably like shouldn't have the superstitious belief or something like that. And so like maybe somehow we think that that makes their belief more acceptable. So that's one possible way of accounting for it. But yeah, I think I share your concerns. There's something weird there. I need to make some changes.
Okay, one or maybe two more, depending.
We'll talk about your second question later.
Thank you. I have something that it probably is best expressed as a suggestion. I mean, there have been a lot of objections here to self-originating view. And I think they basically killed the view as presented. But there are ways in which it can be.
I'm more optimistic.
Well, you know, it's neither necessary nor sufficient. And you want to speak at the same time about collective delusions. So I don't know what stays of the view intact as the view is presented.
Well, I'm interested in what I can say about collective delusions, but I'm certainly not at this point trying to make any claims about collective delusions.
Okay, so let me just say what I wanted to say about the way in which I think something really insightful about what you're saying can be salvaged. And this is perhaps if you abandon the question of what makes belief delusional as answerable only by examination of belief, whether it is an examination of the origin of the belief or evidence responsiveness of the belief, but you look more contextually, especially how the person is socially contextualized in terms of both belief and habits of behavior. And if you look also at the affective side, because when you come to diagnose somebody with delusions, you never do it on the basis of just single reported belief.
Yes. So
yes, strategically, it may be that we actually never come to this conclusion from the standpoint of belief alone. So why philosophically would we expect that there will be an analysis of when a belief is delusional that precedes our theory of certain kind of psychological condition in which delusions occur together with other manifestations of mental illness?
Okay, no, very good. There's a lot there for me to think about. I do think that like there's something important here about just like for epistemologists, like trying to get a taxonomy of belief that accommodates for like why delusional beliefs seem peculiar or different somehow from ordinary irrational beliefs. So like that's kind of some of the motivation for why I've like isolated delusional mental states in my talk and like perhaps explain some of my background assumptions and commitments there. But I do think that this social contextualization point is something I should consider more. Thank you very much.
Okay, unfortunately, there are a lot of questions we just don't have time to get to. Just a mark of how interesting and provocative your talk was. So let's just thank Amanda. We'll resume in 10 minutes.